What secrets lie behind the monstrous face of the Minotaur, and could there be more humanity in the beast than in the men who hunt it? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight's tale is The Minotaur by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a classic tale reimagined and retold for the modern age. Long ago, in the shadow of a towering mountain, there was a city called Troezene. And in that city, a boy named Theseus lived, a boy whose spirit was bright, even if his years were few. His grandfather, King Pythius, ruled the land, renowned for his wisdom. Growing up in the palace, surrounded by knowledge and guidance, Theseus soaked up every lesson, as eager and curious as any child could be. Theseus's mother, Aethra, was his constant companion. His father? He had never seen him. Yet every day, Aethra would take Theseus deep into the woods to a hidden moss-covered rock sunk so low it seemed to belong to the earth itself. There, among the whispering trees, she spoke of the father he had never met, a king named Aegis, ruler of mighty Athens, a city famed across the lands. Theseus listened with wide eyes, imagining the grandeur of a father he had never known. Why doesn't he come to Troezene, he would ask, the question burning in his young heart. Aethra's voice trembled with both pride and sorrow. My child, she said, a king's duty is to his people. To them he is like a father, but to you he cannot yet give the love you deserve. He cannot leave Athens for a mere boy, not even for you. Theseus frowned, a spark of determination lighting in his gaze. But why can't I go to Athens? Why can't I tell him that I am his son? Patience, my dear, Aethra replied softly. The time will come, but you are not yet strong enough for such a journey. You must grow and learn and become more than a boy. You must become a young man. Theseus looked down at the rock beneath him, moss curling around its edges, sun-dappled and solid. How will I know when I am strong enough? Aethra smiled, a secret glint in her eyes. Try lifting this rock, she said, and you will see how much you have yet to grow. Theseus, small yet fearless, had always believed himself stronger than he truly was. Determined, he wrapped his tiny hands around the jagged surface of the mossy rock and pulled with all his might. He tugged, he strained, he panted, red-faced and breathless, but the stone did not budge. It seemed as if the earth itself had claimed it, anchoring it deep in its hidden roots. Only a man of legendary strength could have lifted it from its earthy cradle. Aethra watched him silently, a gentle, wistful smile touching her lips. Her heart ached a little, seeing her son so eager, so impatient for adventure, yet still so small. She knew the world was waiting for him, but he was not yet ready to meet it. You see, my brave boy, she said softly, I must grow far stronger than this before I can trust you to journey to Athens and tell King Aegis that he has a son. But one day, Theseus, one day, when you can lift this rock and reveal what lies hidden beneath it, then I will give you my blessing to go. Days turned to months and months to years, yet the boy never forgot the challenge. Over and over he asked his mother if the time had come, and over she pointed to the rock, a silent reminder that he was not yet ready. And over Theseus pulled, tugged, and strained at the heavy stone, his rosy cheeks and curly hair glistening with effort. Even a giant, he imagined, would have needed all his strength to lift it. Meanwhile, the world around the rock slowly claimed it. Moss thickened, curling across its surface like a soft green cloak. Autumn leaves drifted down from the trees above, covering it in a blanket of brown. Ferns and wildflowers crept along its edges, hiding its secrets almost entirely from view. To any passerby, it seemed no different from the ground itself, immovable and eternal. Yet Theseus did not despair. Each tug, Each pull, each strained breath made him feel alive. He was growing, stronger, taller, more determined. And in his heart, he knew that the day would come when he could finally lift the stone, confront its secret, and step into the world waiting for him beyond the woods. "Mother, I think it's moving," Theseus shouted, breathless but triumphant. "The ground around it's cracked. I swear it's shifting." Aethra's eyes widened, a mixture of alarm and disbelief in her gaze. "No, my child, that's impossible. You are still so young. The rock cannot budge for someone like you." But Theseus insisted, pointing to a small uprooted flower stem as proof of his tiny victory. Aethra sighed, uneasy, her heart torn between pride and fear. She realized with a pang that her son was no longer the little boy she had cradled. He was growing into the man she would soon have to send out into a world full of dangers, mysteries, and unknown trials. Nearly a year passed. Once again they sat upon the familiar moss-covered stone. Aethra told him again, as she had countless times before, the story of his father, King Aegeus of Athens, and how he would welcome Theseus at his grand palace, presenting him before his courtiers and subjects as the heir to his mighty kingdom. Theseus listened, but the story could hardly hold him. His eyes sparkled with impatience and fire, and he could barely remain seated as his heart thumped with growing strength and ambition. "Mother," he said, his voice steady and certain, "I feel different now, stronger, no longer a child, no longer a mere boy. I am ready. The time has come to lift the rock once and for all." Aethra's lips trembled, half warning, half wonder. "Not yet, my dearest Theseus." "No, mother," he said firmly, eyes blazing with resolve. "It is time. I must try. I will succeed, or leave this stone as my monument forever." He crouched low, bracing every muscle. With a heart full of courage, he wrestled the stubborn rock as if it were a living, breathing foe. He strained, he heaved, pouring all his strength and spirit into the task. The earth groaned beneath him. Roots and shrubs tore away as the stone began to shift, slowly, stubbornly, but surely. Aethra clutched her hands to her chest, a rush of pride and sorrow flooding her at once. And then, bit by bit, the rock lifted, uprooting the moss and flowers, tilting to one side as if acknowledging defeat. Theseus had done it. He had conquered the impossible. Breathing heavily but triumphant, Theseus looked at his mother, and through her tears she smiled back at him. "Yes, Theseus," Aethra said, her voice both proud and tender. "The time has come. You will no longer remain at my side. Look beneath the stone. Your father, King Aegeus of Athens, left something for you here when he lifted it with his mighty arms and placed it on this very spot." Theseus leaned forward, eyes wide, and saw that the massive rock had concealed another slab beneath it. The space beneath formed a hollow, like a rough-hewn chest, where the stone above had served as a lid. Inside lay a sword with a golden hilt, and a pair of sandals glinting as if they were waiting just for him. "That sword belonged to your father," Aethra said softly, "and these were his sandals. When he became king of Athens, he commanded that I treat you as a child until you could prove yourself a man by lifting this stone. Now that you have done so, put on his sandals to follow in his footsteps, and gird yourself with his sword. One day you will face giants and dragons as your father did in his youth." "I will set out for Athens today," Theseus declared, his heart pounding with excitement and resolve. But Aethra, wise and cautious, persuaded him to wait a day or two, to prepare the necessities for his journey. When word reached his grandfather, the venerable King Pythius, he offered earnest advice. "Take a vessel, Theseus. Go by sea. In this way, you can reach within 15 miles of Athens with far less danger and fatigue. The roads by land," Pythius warned, "are treacherous, filled with robbers and monsters. They are no place for a boy, even one as brave as you." Yet the moment he heard of robbers and monsters, a spark ignited in his eyes. The warning only fueled his courage. Danger called to him like a challenge, and the boy who had lifted a stone no man could move was eager, more than eager, to take the road where such perils awaited. On the third day, Theseus bid a heartfelt farewell to his grandfather, bowing with respect and gratitude. He embraced his mother tightly, letting a few tears fall, some hers, some his own. But he did not linger in sorrow. The sun warmed his face, the wind dried his cheeks, and soon he was striding confidently down the road, playing with the golden hilt of his father's sword, his feet stepping firmly into the sandals that had once belonged to King Aegeus. In that moment, he was no longer a boy. He was a young man, setting out to claim his destiny. The road to Athens held countless perils, far more than any ordinary traveler could endure. But Theseus was no ordinary boy. He swept through the countryside, confronting and defeating the robbers that had terrified even the wisest men. One such villain was Procrustes, a monstrous brute with a cruel sense of hospitality. He lured travelers into his cavern, offering a bed as if in kindness, but woe to anyone who lay upon it. Too short, he would stretch them with terrifying force. Too tall, he would lop off their feet, or worse, and laugh at their suffering as though it were a joke. Theseus, however, never feared the bed of Procrustes. He overcame the fiend with courage and cunning, ridding the road of his wickedness. Another robber, Skinnies, terrorized travelers by flinging them off a high cliff into the sea. When Theseus met him, he returned the favor with perfect justice. He cast Skinnies from the cliff, but in a strange twist of fate, neither the sea nor the land would claim such a corrupt soul. Suspended between earth and water, Skinnies hung as if the very air itself were forced to bear the weight of his evil deeds. But Theseus's heroism did not end with men. He soon heard of a monstrous sow, a terrifying beast that ravaged the farms and fields of the surrounding villages. Without hesitation, Theseus hunted and killed the creature, turning its carcass into sustenance for the people. In every act, against men, monsters, and beasts, he proved that courage, justice, and strength were his alone. The great sow had once been a terrifying terror of the woods and fields, yet now, carved into golden brown joints, it had become a feast for the people, its menace replaced by warmth and plenty on countless tables. By the time Theseus reached Athens, he had accomplished deeds that would be spoken of for years. With his father's golden-hilted sword in hand, he had faced robbers, beasts, and monsters, and each conquest added to his growing fame. His reputation had traveled faster than his own steps, arriving in Athens before him. As he entered the city, he could hear whispers at street corners, conversations between shopkeepers, farmers, and children. Hercules was brave, they said, and Jason too, and Castor and Pollux, but this young man, Theseus, son of our king, will surely rival the greatest heroes of them all. Hearing such praise, Theseus straightened his shoulders and took longer, prouder strides. He imagined the reception awaiting him at his father's palace, the trumpets of fame heralding his arrival, the people cheering, and King Aegeus himself exclaiming, "Behold your son!" Yet the boy, still innocent and full of youthful confidence, could not know the dangers lurking within the very city he called home. Athens, though ruled by his father, was filled with treacherous currents of ambition. King Aegeus, though not old, was weary from the burdens of rule, and his nephews, cousins to Theseus, saw his weariness as an opportunity. They had plotted to seize the crown and scepter for themselves, but news of Theseus's arrival and of the bravery and strength he displayed along his journey threatened their schemes. He would not allow them to steal what was rightfully his. And worse still, a far more dangerous enemy watched from the shadows. Medea, the cunning and wicked enchantress, now queen and mother to another heir, she hated Theseus and sought to place her son Metis on the throne instead. Her magic and malice made her a foe unlike any Theseus had faced on the road, one whose schemes could strike at the very heart of Athens. As Theseus approached the grand entrance of the royal palace, fate delivered him straight into the path of his father's scheming nephews. They recognized him instantly, and masking their envy and malice, greeted him as though he were a cherished cousin. Their smiles were warm, their voices full of false cheer, and they insisted that Theseus enter the king's presence as a stranger, just to see if King Aegeus would notice any resemblance to himself or to Aethra and recognize the young man as his son. Theseus, trusting in his father's love and the strength of his own heart, agreed. He believed that the connection between father and son would shine through immediately. But the nephews were cunning, and their words carried poison before Theseus even entered the palace. They ran ahead to the king and spoke with deceitful urgency. "A young man has arrived, your majesty. He is no ordinary youth. We know for certain that he intends to kill you and claim your crown." King Aegeus's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" he said, his voice trembling with a mix of curiosity and alarm. "Then tell me, what would you have me do with such a wicked young fellow?" At that moment, Medea, the king's wife, and a woman as cunning as she was dangerous, spoke. Known far and wide as a master enchantress, she had a reputation for horrors the imagination could scarcely hold. Some whispered that she could boil old men in her cauldron under the pretense of restoring their youth, a notion King Aegeus wisely avoided. Others spoke of her fiery chariot drawn by winged dragons soaring through the clouds on journeys both magnificent and terrifying. This same chariot had carried her to Athens, where her cleverness and mischief had caused endless trouble ever since. But perhaps most feared of all was her knowledge of poisons. With a mere touch to the lips, she could extinguish a life instantly, leaving no trace, no chance for mercy. Medea's dark influence now hovered over the palace, ready to strike against the boy who had conquered beasts, robbers, and monsters, yet had never faced such cunning or danger before. When the king asked what should be done with Theseus, Medea, ever cunning and cruel, had an answer ready without hesitation. "Leave it to me, your majesty," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with false concern. "Admit this young man into your presence, treat him politely as any guest deserves, then offer him a goblet of wine. You know I sometimes amuse myself by distilling very potent medicines. This little vial contains one such brew, just a single drop in his drink, and I promise you he will abandon all the wicked designs he brings with him." Medea smiled as she spoke, but behind that courteous expression lay nothing but murderous intent. Her plan was to poison the innocent Theseus right before his father's eyes, and King Aegeus, like many rulers, believed that anyone suspected of plotting against him deserved the harshest remedies. He raised no objection, and soon the wine, dark and ominous, was prepared. The order was given. The young stranger was to be admitted into the royal presence. The goblet was placed carefully on a table beside the king's throne. Even a fly, bold enough to sip from its brim, fell instantly lifeless. Medea glanced at the nephews, her smile spreading once more, quiet triumph glinting in her eyes. When Theseus entered the royal apartment, nothing caught his attention except the figure of the king. There, upon a magnificent throne, sat the white-bearded monarch. A dazzling crown rested upon his head, a scepter gripped in his hand. Though his posture was stately, Each year of rule, each burden of responsibility weighed heavily upon him, as if invisible stones and leaden lumps pressed down upon his shoulders. Tears sprang to Theseus's eyes, not from fear, but from a mixture of sorrow and joy. How fragile his father seemed, yet how majestic! How sweet it would be, he thought, to lend his youthful strength to support him, to lift some of the weight from those weary shoulders, and to bring joy back to the man whose blood ran in his veins. When a son takes his father into his heart, it can restore youth far more powerfully than any spell, or even Medea's enchanted cauldron. This was exactly what Theseus intended. His heart leapt with impatience. He could scarcely wait to see whether King Aegeus would recognize him, and he longed to throw himself into his father's arms. As he advanced to the foot of the throne, he tried to speak the little speech he had practiced on the stairs, but words failed him. His throat tightened, choked by a surge of emotions, love, hope, reverence, and longing, all fighting to escape at once. The boy could barely breathe, and he knew not how to convey the full, overflowing strength of his heart. Medea, watching closely, saw the turmoil with wicked delight. At that moment, her malice burned brighter than ever. Trembling with anticipation of his destruction, she whispered into the king's ear, "Do you see his confusion, your majesty? He trembles with guilt, unable to speak. He is far too daring to live. Quick, offer him the wine." But King Aegeus, despite her whisper, could not turn his gaze from the young man. There was something, he did not know what, in the fine line of the boy's brow, the gentle curve of his mouth, the tender light in his eyes. A vague, stirring memory tugged at him. Had he not held this child on his knee as a baby? Had he not watched him grow strong and fearless, while he himself aged and grew weary? Medea, sensing the stirrings of recognition, worked her magic to twist the king's perception. Her enchantments blurred his vision, clouded his judgment, and cast a shadow over the voice of his own heart, the part that knew deep down that this was indeed his son, Aethra's son, come to claim him as father. Yet for the moment her dark influence held him fast, forcing him to see all through a veil of deception. King Aegeus resolved, at last, to have Theseus drink the wine. "Young man," he said, his voice both proud and wary, "you are welcome here. I am honored to show hospitality to so heroic a youth. Pray, drink from this goblet. It overflows with wine of the finest vintage, such as I offer only to those most worthy. None is more worthy than you." He lifted the golden goblet from the table, extending it toward Theseus. Yet the king's hand trembled. Age and infirmity weighed upon him. The thought of taking this young man's life chilled his heart, and perhaps, deep down, his wiser instincts quivered at what he was about to do. Wine sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the floor. One of the king's scheming nephews leaned in, hissing words meant to spur action. "Your Majesty, do you doubt this stranger's guilt? That sword at his side is the very one he intended to strike you with, sharp, deadly, and terrible. Quick, give him the wine, or perhaps he will act before you." At that, Aegeus banished every thought but one, justice, or what he believed to be justice. He straightened in his throne, grasped the goblet with firm hands, and fixed Theseus with a frown of stern authority. Even in the act of administering death, he could not bring himself to smile deceitfully upon the boy. "Drink," he commanded, in a tone that carried the weight of a judge condemning a criminal. "You have earned this wine as your due." Theseus reached for the goblet, but before his fingers touched it, Aegeus's gaze fell upon the young man's sword, the golden-hilted weapon that gleamed at his side. His eyes widened, heart pounding. "That sword!" he cried, voice trembling with shock and dawning realization. How came you by it?" "It is my father's sword.
Theseus said, his voice trembling with emotion. "These were his sandals. My mother, Aethra, told me his story when I was but a child. Only a month ago I grew strong enough to lift the heavy stone and claim the sword and sandals hidden beneath it. Now I have come to Athens to find my father." "My son! My son!" cried King Aegeus, flinging the poisoned goblet aside and tottering from his throne to fall into Theseus's arms. "Yes, yes, these are Aethra's eyes. It is my son." The fate of the king's scheming nephews fades into the shadows here, for the greater threat was Medea, the wicked enchantress. Furious at the sudden turn of events, she fled to her private chamber, where her dark magic stirred. In moments, a tremendous hissing sounded outside. Her fiery chariot had appeared, drawn by 4 enormous winged serpents, their tails twisting higher than the palace towers, poised for flight.
Medea wasted no time. She seized her son, snatched the crown jewels, the king's finest robes, and every treasure within reach. Mounting the chariot, she lashed the serpents and soared above Athens, leaving chaos in her wake. The king, hearing the terrifying hiss of her monstrous mounts, scrambled to the window and shouted at her to never return. All of Athens had poured into the streets to witness this marvel, and now they cheered at the prospect of her departure. But Medea, blinded by rage, unleashed a scream 10 times more venomous than her serpent's hissing. Flames danced across the chariot as she glared down at the crowd, shaking her hands as if to scatter 1,000,000 curses upon them. Yet even in her fury she could not undo what had been done. Theseus had claimed his father, his destiny, and the people of Athens rejoiced to see evil driven away. In her frantic escape, Medea inadvertently dropped a fortune beyond imagining. 500 flawless diamonds, 1,000 enormous pearls, and thousands more of emeralds, rubies, sapphires, opals, and topazes, all stolen from the king's treasure chest. They fell like a dazzling rain of multicolored hail upon the heads of astonished children and adults alike. Quick as thought, the crowd gathered the gems and carried them back to the palace. King Aegeus, overjoyed at finding his son and seeing the wicked enchantress flee, declared the treasures theirs to keep, every gem and twice as many more if he had them. Indeed, if one had seen the last venomous glare Medea cast from her flaming serpent-driven chariot, it would have been clear why both king and people rejoiced at her departure. From that day on, Prince Theseus won his father's favor completely. The old king delighted in having him beside the throne, wide enough for 2, listening to tales of his beloved mother Aethra, his childhood, and the boyish feats of lifting the great stone. But Theseus was no ordinary youth, too brave and restless to dwell on past adventures. His heart yearned for new deeds, challenges worthy of legend and song. It wasn't long before he captured a ferocious, maddened bull, chaining it for all to see, a feat that earned the awe of King Aegeus and the admiration of every citizen. Yet even this act would soon pale in comparison to what awaited him. One morning, Theseus awoke with a strange heaviness in his mind. It felt as if a sorrowful dream lingered, still running through his thoughts even with open eyes. Little did he know that this morning would mark the beginning of a challenge so formidable it would make all his previous feats seem like mere boyish play. As Theseus awoke that morning, a strange, mournful sound filled the air. At first it seemed like a melancholy wail carried on the wind, but when he listened more closely, he realized it was a chorus of grief, sobs, groans, and screams of despair, mingling with low, sorrowful sighs. The cries came from the king's palace, from the streets, from the temples, and from every home in Athens. 1,000 hearts, each weighed down with fear and sorrow, had united into a single, overwhelming sound of anguish, pulling Theseus from his sleep. He dressed quickly, lacing on his father's sandals and grasping the golden-hilted sword at his side, and rushed to his father to learn the cause of such woe. "Alas, my son," said King Aegeus, sighing deeply, "a grievous matter darkens this day. It is the day when we draw lots to see which youths and maidens of Athens will be sent to face the horror of the Minotaur." "The Minotaur!" exclaimed Theseus, his hand immediately falling to the hilt of his sword. "A monster, you say? Surely it can be slain, even at the risk of one's life." But King Aegeus shook his head solemnly and explained the grim reality. "This creature," he said, "lives on the island of Crete. A Minotaur, part man, part bull, is a being so hideous that it pains the mind even to picture him. If such a monster must exist at all, it should be confined to some remote, desolate place, far from the eyes of men. Yet King Minos of Crete built for him a grand dwelling, lavished upon him care and provisions, simply for cruelty's sake. Some years ago," the king continued, "Athens fought a war with Crete and was defeated. As part of the peace, we were forced to send our children to this monster as a tribute to Minos's malice. Every year the lot falls on young Athenians, and the city trembles in grief at the thought of our children being devoured. Peace, however, had come at a terrible price. Athens was granted mercy only on one cruel condition. Every year, 7 young men and 7 young women were to be sent across the sea to be fed to the favored monster of the merciless King Minos. For 3 long years the city had endured this nightmare, and now the fatal day had returned once more. The cries filling the streets were not the sounds of a single tragedy, but of thousands unfolding at once. Parents clutched their children in fear, wondering whose son or daughter fate would claim. Young men and maidens trembled, knowing the lot might fall upon their own names, condemning them to the ravenous jaws of that loathsome half-man, half-beast. When Theseus heard the full weight of this injustice, something changed within him. He stood straighter, as if his very spirit had lifted his frame. His face burned with many emotions at once: anger at the cruelty, defiance toward tyranny, courage unshaken by fear, and a deep, aching compassion for his people. "Let Athens draw lots for only 6 young men this year," he said firmly. "I will be the 7th. And let the Minotaur attempt to devour me, if he dares." "My beloved son," cried King Aegeus, his voice breaking, "why would you condemn yourself to such a fate? You are a prince. You stand above the doom of ordinary men." "It is precisely because I am your son, a prince and the heir to this kingdom," Theseus replied, his voice calm but unyielding, "that I must bear the burden of my people. You are their king, answerable to the gods for their safety. It is our duty to give what is dearest to us, rather than allow even the poorest citizen to suffer in our place." Tears filled the old king's eyes. He pleaded with Theseus not to abandon him to loneliness in his final years, especially now that he had only just discovered the joy of having a brave and noble son. But Theseus's resolve did not falter. He knew in the deepest part of his heart that this was the path he must walk. Still, he clasped his father's hands and spoke with quiet determination. "Do not fear for me," he said. "I do not go to Crete to die like a helpless lamb. If the Minotaur means to feast on me, he shall first earn his meal, with blood, steel, and battle. At last, King Aegeus, with a heavy heart, gave his reluctant consent. A vessel was prepared, its sails black as morning, and Prince Theseus stepped aboard with 6 other young men and 7 fair, trembling maidens. The harbor was crowded with sorrowful faces. The citizens of Athens, parents and elders alike, lined the shore, hearts heavy with fear. Even the old king leaned upon his son's arm, his expression weighed down as if he alone carried the grief of the entire city. Just as Theseus was about to set foot on the deck, King Aegeus remembered one final warning, one last wish to entrust to his brave son. "My beloved Theseus," he said, grasping the prince's hand tightly, "you see these black sails? They mark a voyage of sorrow and despair. I know not if my frail life will last until your return, but while I live, I will climb daily to the cliff above to watch the horizon. If, by some miracle, you escape the jaws of the Minotaur, then tear down these mournful sails and raise new ones bright as the sun itself. When Athens sees them, we will know your victory is certain, and the city will welcome you with a celebration unlike any it has ever known." Theseus nodded solemnly, his gaze steady and determined. With that promise, he stepped fully aboard. The mariners adjusted the black sails, catching a faint wind off the shore, soft, sorrowful, and almost as if the breath of the grieving city itself pushed them onward. Soon, however, a stronger breeze swept in from the northwest, tossing the vessel over sparkling white-capped waves. It carried them with a strange joy, as if the sea itself conspired to help them on their grim mission. And though the journey was shadowed by dread, it seems unlikely that 14 young people, unrestrained by elders, could remain entirely melancholy. Laughter, whispers, and nervous chatter found their way aboard, blending with the sound of wind and wave, and a spark of courage grew in the hearts of all who sailed toward Crete and the terrible Minotaur that awaited them. A few moments of light-heartedness had found their way aboard the ship, some tentative dances on the rolling deck, bursts of laughter and whispered jokes among the 14 voyagers. But as the high, jagged peaks of Crete began to emerge from the distant clouds, the gravity and dread settled over them once more. Theseus pressed forward among the sailors, eyes fixed on the approaching land, though it still seemed almost unreal, a hazy outline rising from the mist. At intervals he thought he caught a sudden flash, a streak of light darting across the waves far off the shore. "Did you see that?" he asked the master of the vessel. "No, Prince," the old seaman replied, "but I have seen it before. It must be Talus." Before Theseus could ask more, the wind strengthened, and the sailors hurried to trim the sails. The vessel surged forward, cutting through the white-capped waves toward the forbidding island. Then, as they neared the coast, a sight made the young prince's heart skip. A figure, immense and human-shaped, moving along the cliffed edges with measured, deliberate steps. From one crag to another, from headland to headland, it strode, and the sea foamed violently beneath it, casting sprays of water over its massive feet. What was most astonishing was the way it glimmered in the sunlight. Its face and limbs gleamed with a metallic sheen, throwing flashes across the air, while the folds of its garments hung heavy, as if they were wrought from brass or some strange alloy rather than cloth. The closer the ship sailed, the more Theseus realized the unnatural quality of its movement. There was a jerkiness to its stride, a mechanical precision that made him doubt it was truly alive. And yet, terrifying as it was, the figure carried an enormous brass club across its shoulder, a weapon that seemed capable of crushing a man with a single swing. Theseus's hand drifted toward the hilt of his sword. His mind raced. Whether the giant or machine was alive or not, whether it was friend or foe, it would not be an idle witness to his mission. The young prince's heart throbbed with both fear and exultation. Crete and its horrors were finally before him. "What is that marvel?" Theseus asked, his eyes never leaving the towering figure as it loomed over the jagged coast. The master of the vessel, now free to answer, spoke gravely. "That, young prince, is Talus, the man of brass." Theseus squinted. "Is he alive or just a brazen statue?" The sailor shook his head, uncertainty etched deep in his weathered face. "That's the mystery, sir. Some claim he was forged by Vulcan himself for King Minos, the greatest smith of all time. But consider this. What statue could possibly march around an island 3 times a day as Talus does and challenge every ship that dares approach the shore? And what living creature, unless its sinews were made of solid brass, could cover 1,800 miles in a single day without ever resting? He confounds logic, Prince. Take him as you will." Meanwhile, the vessel surged forward over the frothing waves, each gust of wind driving it closer to the Cretan coast. Theseus heard it then, the deafening clang of Talus's heavy footsteps pounding the sea-battered rocks below. With each step, stones cracked, splintered, and toppled into the foaming surf. As the ship neared the harbor entrance, Talus stretched across it like a living gate, feet planted on opposite headlands. The club in his hand shot upward so high that its butt vanished into the clouds. Sunlight struck his metallic body, turning the giant into a dazzling, terrifying spectacle. Every sailor aboard held their breath, expecting the inevitable, the club crashing down, shattering their vessel to splinters, and perhaps taking every life aboard. After all, there is rarely mercy in a giant, or in a machine forged of brass. And then, against all expectation, the brazen lips parted. A deep, resonant voice rolled across the waves. "Whence come you, strangers?" The young prince gripped the hilt of his sword, heart hammering. He had never faced anything like this before, and yet he knew he must answer with courage, for Crete and its horrors awaited, and the Minotaur was still to come. As the brazen voice faded, a deep reverberation lingered, like the echo inside a great cathedral bell long after a hammer strikes. "From Athens," the ship's master called boldly. "On what errand?" boomed Talus, the man of brass, and he lifted his massive club even higher, as though ready to crush the vessel in a single thunderous stroke. Crete still bore old grudges against Athens. "We bring 7 youths and 7 maidens to be offered to the Minotaur." "Pass," thundered Talus. The single word rolled across the sky, vibrating through his metallic chest like a living drum. With that, the ship slid safely between the jagged headlands, and the colossal sentinel resumed its endless patrol. In moments, Talus had disappeared into the sun-drenched distance, striding around Crete with mechanical precision, a tireless guardian of the island. No sooner had they entered the harbor than a squad of Minos's guards descended to the shore, taking charge of the 14 young men and women. Surrounded by armed warriors, Theseus and his companions were escorted to the king's palace, where they were brought before the stern and unyielding monarch himself. King Minos was a man of iron. If Talus's body was brass, Minos's heart was harder still. His shaggy brows shadowed the young Athenians like storm clouds. Any ordinary ruler, confronted by such innocent faces, fresh and bright with life, might have felt a pang of mercy, or at least unease, until all were safely freed. Not Minos. His gaze measured only whether these victims were plump enough and fit enough to satisfy the terrible appetite of the Minotaur. If you ask me, it would have been a far better fate for the king himself to face the beast. At least the monster might have found a challenge in him, rather than the trembling, unwilling children of Athens. One by one, King Minos summoned the pale, trembling youths and tearful maidens to his golden throne. Each was prodded in the ribs with the sharp end of his scepter, a cruel test of their flesh's plumpness, and then dismissed to the waiting guards. Fear clung to them like a second skin, and their sobs echoed in the cold marble hall. But when Minos's gaze fell on Theseus, everything changed. The young prince stood tall, calm and unflinching, his eyes steady with quiet courage. The king leaned forward, his voice a low rumble of authority. "Are you not terrified, boy?" Minos demanded. "Do you not fear being devoured by the Minotaur?" "I give my life willingly," Theseus replied, his tone ringing with conviction. "For a noble cause it is a gift, not a burden. But tell me, King Minos, year after year you condemn innocent youths and maidens to this monstrous fate. Do your eyes never turn inward? Does your heart not quake at the cruelty you perpetuate? Sitting there in your golden throne, wrapped in robes of majesty, you are a monster far more terrible than the Minotaur himself." A sharp, cruel laugh burst from the king. "Ah, you dare call me a monster?" he hissed. "Tomorrow at breakfast you will have the chance to decide for yourself which is the greater horror, the Minotaur or the king." His guard stepped forward, and with a single nod he commanded, "Take this bold youth. Let him be the first feast of the beast." Near the throne, quietly observing, stood Princess Ariadne. Unlike her father, her heart was tender and full of compassion. She watched the doomed captives, imagining the stolen happiness of so many young lives, offered to a creature who surely would have preferred a fat ox or a plump pig to a living, breathing human. And when her gaze met Theseus, steadfast, fearless, calm even in the shadow of certain death, her sorrow deepened 100-fold. Ariadne's eyes glistened with unshed tears. In that moment she knew she could not remain a passive witness to such cruelty. As the guards began to lead him away, Ariadne flung herself to the cold stone floor at her father's feet. "Father, have mercy," she cried. "Release them all. Spare these innocent youths, and especially this young man. He is no common boy. He is brave, noble, and worthy of your protection." "Peace, foolish girl," thundered King Minos, his voice echoing like iron in the hall. "What concern is it of yours? This is a matter of state, far beyond the reach of your weak understanding. Go tend to your flowers, and meddle no more in the affairs of Athenian caitiffs. The Minotaur will see to them for breakfast, just as surely as I shall eat a partridge tonight." The king's gaze was as cruel as a blade. One might have thought he would devour Theseus and the other captives himself, had the Minotaur not already claimed the task. Ariadne's pleas were silenced, and the prisoners were herded into a dank, shadowed dungeon. The jailer muttered a grim warning. "Sleep now if you can. The Minotaur rises early." The 7 maidens and 6 of the young men wept themselves into slumber, their sobs muffled by the stone walls. But Theseus did not sleep. His mind raced with strategy and courage. He was stronger, wiser, and braver than his companions, and he felt the weight of all their lives upon his shoulders. He paced the cold, gloomy dungeon, considering every possibility, searching for a way to defy fate itself. Just before the clock struck midnight, a soft sound stirred the shadows. The door creaked gently, and a pale light flickered across the stone floor. Ariadne appeared, in a small torch in her hand, her eyes bright with determination. "Are you awake, Prince Theseus?" she whispered. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady, though his heart beat fiercely. "With so little time to live, I will waste none in sleep." "Then follow me," she breathed, treading softly. How the jailer and guards had vanished, Theseus never knew, but by some stroke of fortune, or perhaps by the quiet magic of Ariadne, he followed her out of the dungeon. The darkness gave way to the silvery moonlight, and the fresh, cool air of the night seemed to fill his lungs with courage. Freedom, hope, and the shadow of destiny awaited him beyond the prison walls. "Prince Theseus," whispered the maiden, her voice trembling like the flutter of a candle flame, "you may now take your vessel and sail safely back to Athens." "No," Theseus answered firmly, his eyes alight with determination. "I will not leave Crete until I have faced the Minotaur, freed my companions, and delivered Athens from this cruel tribute." "I knew your heart would choose this path," Ariadne said, her gaze steady and full of admiration. "Then come with me, brave Theseus. Here is your sword, reclaimed from the guards. You will need it, and may heaven guide your hand." She took his hand, small and gentle but full of courage, and led him through a dark, shadowy grove. The moonlight spilled feebly upon the tops of the trees, failing to illuminate the path beneath, leaving them to move through near complete darkness. Their footsteps were muffled by the soft earth, and a sense of dread and wonder hung thick in the air. After some way, they came upon a marble wall, towering, massive, and overgrown with creeping vines that made it seem almost alive. It had no doors, no windows, no passage, and seemed as impenetrable as fate itself. Theseus gazed at it, uncertain how they might continue, but Ariadne merely pressed a delicate finger against a particular block of marble. Though solid as stone to all appearances, it yielded under her touch. With a soft, almost inaudible click, a narrow entrance opened, just wide enough for them to slip through. The marble swung quietly back into place behind them. "We are now," she said in a low voice, "within the Labyrinth of Daedalus, built before he fashioned wings for himself and flew away like a bird. Daedalus was a master of cunning, and of all his clever devices, this maze is the most wondrous and fearsome. Take but a few steps from this doorway, and you might wander for a lifetime without finding your way again. Yet in the very center, Theseus, awaits the Minotaur. You must go there and face him if you would save your companions and end the terror of Athens." "But how shall I ever find him?" asked Theseus, his voice low but steady, "if the labyrinth is as bewildering as you say." At that very moment, a rough and dreadful roar echoed through the shadows. It was deep and guttural, yet curiously human, half a bull's lowing, half a harsh voice shaped into words, as if the creature itself were struggling to speak. Theseus strained his ears, but could not tell if it was the cry of a monstrous beast or some terrible man. "That is the Minotaur," whispered Ariadne, clutching his hand tightly, her own heart quivering in her breast. "You must follow that sound through the twisting windings of the labyrinth. By and by it will lead you to him. Take the end of this silken string, hold it in your hand. I will keep the other. If you triumph, it will guide you back to this very spot. Farewell, brave Theseus." He grasped the string in his left hand, the gold-hilted sword drawn in his right, and stepped boldly into the labyrinth's inscrutable darkness. How it was built, its cunning corridors, its twisting turns, is more than I can tell you. Never before nor since has such a maze been seen, save in the mind of a genius like Daedalus, whose cunning rivaled the very mysteries of the world. The walls seemed alive, turning and twisting, confounding all who dared enter. Not 5 steps had Theseus taken before Ariadne vanished from sight. In a few more, his head began to spin, as if the corridors themselves were swirling around him. He crept through low arches, ascended winding staircases, darted along crooked passages, and past doors that banged shut behind him. Each turn, each twist threatened to make him lose himself forever. Yet he pressed onward, every nerve alert, every sense straining towards the terrible sound that would lead him to the heart of the labyrinth and to the Minotaur. All the while, through the hollow avenues of the labyrinth, the cry of the Minotaur resounded, now nearer, now farther, rising and falling like the groans of a storm-tossed sea. The sound was fierce and cruel, at once like the roar of a bull, and yet like a human voice, and yet like neither. Each step made Theseus's brave heart sterner, angrier, burning with indignation that such a monster should dare exist, a mockery of the moon, the sky, and Mother Earth herself. As he pressed forward, the clouds drifted across the moon, shrouding the labyrinth in a dusky gloom. Paths twisted and turned so that he could scarcely tell one passage from another. He might have been lost forever, wandering helplessly in that endless maze, if it had not been for a gentle tug at the silken cord. Then he knew that Ariadne, tender-hearted and faithful, still held the other end, sending him her sympathy, her hope, her courage, as if she were beside him in person. Oh, there was more human feeling in that slender thread of silk than in all the polished walls of the labyrinth combined. And yet Theseus did not linger. The roar of the Minotaur grew louder, more furious, until it seemed the very air quivered with its rage. Every zigzag and twist of the path brought him closer, until at last he reached an open space at the very heart of the labyrinth, and there he beheld the creature itself. Sure enough, it was a hideous monster. Its head was horned like a bull's, and yet in its gait it waddled grotesquely on hind legs, so that at times it seemed more human than beast. And at other moments, if one dared to look differently, it appeared wholly a man, monstrous, unnatural, a perversion of both forms. Alone it lived, companionless, incapable of kindness or love, existing only to terrorize and destroy. There it was, staring at Theseus with eyes that glimmered like embers in the darkness, snorting its dreadful breath, pawing the ground, ready to charge. The young prince raised his golden-hilted sword, muscles taut, courage blazing, and prepared to face the monster that had made Athens tremble for so many sorrowful years. Theseus's eyes never wavered from the monstrous figure. He could see the muscles quivering beneath its hide, the veins swelling in the neck that bore its dreadful horned head. The Minotaur paced back and forth like a caged fury, growling, snorting, and uttering fragments of words that Theseus could somehow understand. How miserable it was, how hungry, how it hated all who lived, and how it longed to devour the human race. And yet, in that awful bull-headed villainy, there was a kind of sorrow that stirred pity in the hero's breast. Ah, my young listeners, let this be a lesson. Every soul that harbors cruelty, every heart that feeds on anger or greed is a kind of Minotaur, separated from kindness, estranged from all fellowship, lost to the better part of life. Was Theseus afraid? By no means. A hero like Theseus feared nothing, not if the Minotaur had 20 heads instead of one, nor claws, nor horns, nor a roar that could shake the very stones. Yet even a hero must sometimes draw courage from those he loves. A gentle, almost imperceptible tug on the silken cord in his left hand reminded him that Ariadne was there, her hope and courage flowing through that thin thread, lending him strength beyond his own. His resolve doubled, his muscles steadied, his breath grew calm but ready. Then the monster saw him. The Minotaur's eyes flared like red coals, and it lowered its terrible horns with a snort that shook the dust from the walls. The roar that followed was more than a sound. It was a tempest of rage and hunger, a voice half beast, half human, shrieking in fury at the sight of Theseus. The young prince held his golden-hilted sword firmly in his right hand, the golden hilt catching what little moonlight filtered through the labyrinth. His left hand gripped the silken cord, heart steady, courage blazing, ready to face the horror before him. And so, in that shadowed heart of the labyrinth, man faced monster, and the battle that would free Athens and seal the hero's glory was about to begin. Theseus stood for a moment, panting, his chest heaving, the gleam of his golden-hilted sword still catching the faint light that filtered through the labyrinth. The awful roar had ceased forever. The Minotaur, that monstrous hybrid of man and bull, lay motionless, its dreadful eyes closed, and its hoarse, half-formed speech silenced for all time. Though the fight had been fierce, though he had felt the pain of the horn that grazed his side, Theseus now felt a rush of triumph mingled with relief. He looked about the labyrinth, the tangled passages suddenly seeming less threatening, the shadows less oppressive, for the greatest danger had been overcome by courage, skill, and the steady heart of a hero. Yet his victory was not only for himself. As he stepped lightly through the open space, following the silken cord that Ariadne still held, his thoughts were with the other young men and maidens, innocent victims who had been condemned to a dreadful fate. One by one he led them out from the darkness, sword ready in hand to defend them from any lingering peril. Their eyes, filled first with terror, now shone with astonishment and gratitude, for they had beheld a man who dared to defy a monster and win. At last, Theseus and the 14 Athenians found themselves at the entrance to the labyrinth. There, waiting in the moonlight, was Ariadne, whose face glowed with both relief and admiration. "Brave Theseus," she whispered, "you have done what none could have dared. Now we must return to the harbor and set sail for Athens, where your father awaits and your triumph will be celebrated." Theseus smiled, but not lightly. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the journey back, of the bright sails that would announce his safe return to King Aegis, and of the happiness he would bring to all of Athens. Yet deep down he knew that the memory of the Minotaur, its rage, its loneliness, and its grotesque, monstrous sorrow would never entirely leave him. For in the heart of danger, in the face of evil, he had discovered something profound, that courage, compassion, and justice are more powerful than even the most fearsome of beasts. And so, with hearts full of hope and the labyrinth now behind them, Theseus and his companions began the voyage home, the first light of dawn glimmering on the distant horizon and the promise of peace and joy awaiting them in Athens. Ariadne looked up at Theseus, her eyes glimmering with both courage and sorrow. "I cannot go without betraying my father, yet to stay means to see more misery inflicted upon innocence," she murmured, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Theseus," she continued, "I will give thee the means to escape safely. Take this," and she drew from her belt a small ball of golden thread, finely spun, with a heart of courage woven into it. "It shall guide thee through every peril that may arise, and show thee the way back should danger again befall. My life may remain in Crete, but my spirit will sail with thee to Athens." Theseus pressed the little gift to his heart. "Then I shall carry thee in my memory, Ariadne, as the guiding light that led me to victory. Thy courage and wisdom will be with me always." With a last clasp of hands, he turned to the vessel, where the other Athenians were already aboard, their faces bright with wonder and relief. The mariners hoisted the black sails, which now seemed less ominous, for the Minotaur's terror had ended, and the first light of dawn painted the horizon with soft gold and rose. As the vessel drifted from the shore, Ariadne waved, and Theseus raised his hand in return. In his heart he carried the triumph of courage over monstrosity, of justice over cruelty, and the knowledge that no labyrinth, no matter how cunningly built, could contain the spirit of a hero guided by wisdom, valor, and compassion. And so, with hearts full of hope and the labyrinth now behind them, Theseus and his companions began the voyage home. The first light of dawn glimmering on the distant horizon, and the promise of peace and joy awaiting them in Athens. Talus, the man of brass, paused for a moment, his metallic gaze sweeping the sea, and then, as if satisfied that no danger threatened the vessel, he resumed his endless patrol along the cliffs of Crete. The waves leapt and sparkled around him, but his enormous strides never faltered, and the echo of his brazen footsteps faded slowly into the distance.
Meanwhile, Theseus stood at the prow of the ship, the wind in his hair and the black sails fluttering behind him. He looked toward the horizon, where the first faint tints of dawn began to lighten the sky. His heart was filled with triumph, for not only had he conquered the dreadful Minotaur, but he had also saved the lives of the innocent Athenians, and now carried them safely toward home. The companions of Athens cheered quietly at first, for they dared not disturb the solemn glory of the moment. But soon their voices rang out in joyful exclamations, and laughter and song filled the vessel, as if the black sails themselves had turned into banners of victory. Each man and maiden felt the warm pride of having survived what seemed an impossible ordeal, and of having been saved by the courage and honor of one young prince. Theseus, however, did not boast. He moved quietly among them, checking that all was safe, encouraging the timid, and sharing a few words of comfort with those who still trembled from the horrors of the labyrinth. And though his mind was full of the events they had just escaped, his thoughts never strayed far from the image of Ariadne, who had given him courage and who, with her gentle wisdom, had guided him through the maze that no mere strength could have conquered. So the vessel pressed on over the sparkling waves, driven by a brisk northerly wind, until at last, in the distance, the coast of Attica began to rise pale and welcoming in the early light of day. And far above on the cliffs of Athens, King Aegeus, leaning on his staff and straining his old eyes, first caught sight of the sails, and felt his heart leap with a joy so great that it seemed as though youth had returned to his worn body. Theseus had returned, victorious, noble, and alive, and Athens would never again be darkened by the shadow of the Minotaur. Ah, here lies the cruel twist of fate. King Aegeus, whose heart had been filled with hope and pride, misread the signal that should have announced victory. The black sails, innocuous in themselves, a mere oversight of the joyful voyagers, seemed to him the omen of his son's death. The old king could scarcely breathe, trembling so violently that his staff threatened to topple him over the edge. With a sinking heart he cried out to the heavens, believing Theseus, the valiant, noble, life-saving Theseus, had been struck down by the Minotaur or lost at sea. The people of Athens, gathering on the cliffs below, saw their king in such despair, and murmurs of fear and sorrow rippled through the crowd. Meanwhile, on the deck of the vessel, Theseus was blissfully unaware of this misapprehension. He laughed and joked with his companions, recounted the defeat of the Minotaur, and shared the marvels of the labyrinth with animated gestures. The maidens and young men clapped, danced, and sang in delight, but not one of them thought of the signal sails. The mariners, busied with ropes and rigging, did not consider it important to adjust that canvas, and so the vessel, triumphant in spirit, yet dark in appearance, glided steadily toward the shore of Attica. What a cruel irony that the very sign meant to proclaim victory became a source of agony for a father's heart. The moment had come when mere color could almost weigh heavier than the brave deeds of Theseus himself. But, as we shall see, dear listeners, such misunderstandings are no match for the courage, wit, and destiny of a hero. Theseus's triumph was far from lost, though the shadow of dread would darken the father's eyes until the truth could be revealed. Ah, the cruel trick of fate strikes at last. Poor King Aegeus, whose heart had been filled with hope and pride, misread the signal that should have announced victory. The black sails, innocuous in themselves, a mere oversight of the joyful voyages, seemed to him the omen of his son's death. Overcome with grief and disbelief, he flung aside crown and scepter, the symbols of his long reign, and cast himself headlong into the foaming sea below. The waves, merciless yet impartial, swallowed the old king,
leaving the city of Athens bereft of his sovereign.
When Theseus finally set foot on his native land, triumphant over the Minotaur and victorious in saving the innocent, he was met not with the rejoicing that he had hoped to share with his father, but with the somber reality of the king's tragic end. Thus, by the most bitter irony, the very signal meant to herald his success brought sorrow instead. Yet, true to his noble character, Theseus did not let despair consume him. He summoned his beloved mother Aethra to Athens, and, guided by her wisdom, assumed the responsibilities of kingship. Through courage, fairness, and steadfastness, he became an excellent monarch, beloved by his people, and the city flourished under his just and heroic rule. So ends the tale of Prince Theseus, brave, selfless, and wise, a hero whose deeds were remembered long after the black sails had passed into legend.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.